Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Polygamy skeptics love to point out that Joseph Smith has been ruled out as the father of several possible polygamous children in Nauvoo. But are there other ways to explain this? Did John C. Bennett perform abortions in Nauvoo? Can two people have sex and not produce children? We'll talk about some of these possibilities in our conversation with attorney Mark Tensmeyer. Check out our conversation. All right, so another couple of topics that I'd like to address are the rumors about Dr. John C. Bennett and abortion, that he was stopping pregnancies with abortion. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, my understanding on that is that there's basically two sources on that. So there's a source I'd have to find it, but where it came out in the trials of the men that were associated with John Bennett. John Bennett, they were going through his excommunication process, and they either did it right away or he left the church and left town before they had the chance to do it. He either resigned, he claims he resigned, and then left town. So it's really when his associates who were involved with him, so Chauncey Higby, Justice Morris, Lyman Littlefield, those individuals who were involved with him, when they're put on trial in the High Council, that a lot of this stuff comes out. And so some of the women had testified that John Bennett had told them that, or one of them had told them that if a pregnancy occurred as a result of their activities, then John Bennett would be able to take care of it. He would be able to remove the baby. He knew how to do that as a doctor. He could terminate the pregnancy. And so there's that source. Then the other source is also years later. I believe it's the 1880s. It's Sarah Pratt. Says that in an interview with the Salt Lake Tribune that John Bennett had an instrument that he would use to perform abortions for Joseph Smith. And so those are pretty much the sources on that.
So we don't have any documented record of any abortions that actually happened. These are more rumors. Is that right?
Well,
I guess it should be pointed out that abortion, there was no legality issues.
Well, there was no legality to taking 4 wives either, or even technically speaking, like that.
Well, but there weren't any laws against abortion, is what I'm trying to say. Were there?
Were there? I don't know. It was.
I don't think those happened until much later.
It might have been, but I mean, there's a few issues with that. I mean, one is we don't really know how involved, if at all, John Bennett was with Joseph. That's one of the things that scholars debate. Like Fawn Brody would say, yeah, they were like Joseph and John Bennett were doing exactly the same thing. They were involved. They were.
Well, he was assistant president of the church and mayor of Nauvoo when he was on good terms. Right,
and so that's the argument for that he was. And so at the other end of the spectrum, you have Brian Hales, who says John Bennett's not an insider to polygamy at all. He just is repeating rumors. But I think really the majority opinion, the ones like if you read like a Nauvoo Polygamy by George D. Smith, he kind of goes maybe not. He doesn't take a stance on it. He goes maybe it was. At one point he says Brigham Young would have been the first man who was, besides Joseph, who became a polygamist in Nauvoo, was authorized by Joseph. Unless John Bennett was, we don't really know. It could be the case that John Bennett was, or that he wasn't. So he doesn't take a stance. I think Gary Begara, he wrote a couple of good articles about John Bennett, and his position I think would be sort of the I would call the majority opinion of scholars. I think the moderate opinion, and that is that John Bennett does have inside knowledge about plural marriage, and I think that's true because a lot of the stuff he says is absolutely ridiculous and not supported by anything else. But then there are a few things like I said earlier, the identity of those 5 women, and in the case of 2 of them,
were plural wives of Joseph.
Yeah, they were plural wives of Joseph Smith, and then in the case of 2 of them, he correctly identifies who it was that performed the ceremony. So I think that there's, I mean, he could have gone that somewhere else, but I don't. I mean, right? I don't know, but I think it does show that he has some. But anyway, what Gary Beguer says is so he has some inside information, but his activities were not authorized by Joseph Smith, and the methods that he employed by getting these women, convincing these women, and what he did with them was not reflective of what Joseph was doing. So, I mean, John Bennett would say, he would tell women, he says, it's no crime for a man and a woman to have carnal relations as long as they keep it a secret. And there's no talk about a ceremony. There's no reference to John Bennett ever doing any kind of marriage ceremony. A lot of like the women that testified, they all testified against the same men as being involved with each of them. So, I mean, so it's a bit. So that's the majority opinion, and I'm partial to that.
Well, and he called it spiritual wifery, which was not the term that Joseph ever used, right?
Yeah. So that's it. I mean, there are times when. Yeah, I mean, that's another thing is they would use celestial marriage insiders, but sometimes the idea is that they would use the term spiritual wife. Sometimes it's because that was the term that was thrown about so much that they just ended up using it sometimes out of convenience because it's what people are familiar with maybe. So, but I mean, that's that. So, I mean, that's it. And I think part of the thing is if we're talking about John Bennett as an explanation for why we don't have any documentation of, or any real sure documentation of any offspring of Joseph.
Yeah, that's a good where I wanted to go.
Then he doesn't really work for that because he's out of the picture by April, May 1842, which is really early in the game. And at that point, Joseph has like eight or 10 plural wives. Most of them don't live most of them either don't live in Nauvoo. I think all of them either don't live in Nauvoo or they have a legal husband. And so theoretically, there's not really a reason for them to hide a pregnancy. They have a legal husband who's aware of the plural marriage. And so there's not really a reason to hide it. It doesn't arouse suspicion that they would become pregnant. And but really it's 1843 is when Joseph is married to, in the middle of 1843, that he's married to the Partridge Sisters and Lucy Walker and Melissa Lott, younger women that actually stay at the mansion house in his house. And John Bennett's out of the picture long before that.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't think that really works. Is it possible that John Bennett? I mean, I got to admit my bias as a believing member that I don't like the idea of Joseph Smith doing abortions. Objectively speaking, I can't really discount it, but I don't think the evidence is so strong that we should say it did happen. I mean, we really just have one source that says that John Bennett suggested it, not necessarily that Joseph did. And then there's Sarah Pratt, who has some reliability issues. The question came up when William Law was doing his interview with Wilhelm Weil for the Salt Lake Tribune, and at that point, William Law's he really paints Joseph in a very, very bad picture. But the question comes up with their abortions, and he said, "I don't think so." And of course, he wasn't privy to what was going on when John Bennett was around, but Chauncey Higbee was, and he knew Chauncey Higbee pretty well and worked with Chauncey Higbee. And he says, "I don't think so. I didn't really hear anything about it."
So it seems unlikely that abortions would have happened, right?
It's unlikely. I mean, I can't say objectively that I can rule it out, but and there is again there are sources, but I can say that I don't think the sources we have really really direct us to that conclusion.
Yeah, I'll just add one other story. There's a great book. Do I have it here? Real Native Genius. That's somewhere on my shelves here. Warner McCary, his wife, Lucy Stanton, who was the daughter of the stake president in Nauvoo, they left town, and she later performed some abortions in New York, and the women died. So abortions were obviously hazardous to your health. Lucy was actually jailed for years in New York for manslaughter, for performing these abortions, and the women died. So I think that adds even more.
I think it is. I mean, that's something you could look at and say that that's something that would have been really hard to keep under wraps. There would have been safer ways to handle a woman becoming pregnant, like passing it off as somebody else's kid.
Right.
And saying, I mean, there would have been easier ways to do that. Yeah, I don't know, my thoughts on that.
Okay. So the other issue is, I know that Brian Hales and Ugo Perego, Ugo did the tests to see if there were children of other women. And I know a lot of polygamy deniers have said, hey, where's the DNA evidence? Because in all 5 or 6 cases, these children, Joseph Smith has been ruled out as the father of these children. But of course, there are other ways to have sexual relations that don't produce babies.
Right. Right. And so I don't think that those DNA evidence that really discredits anybody. In all cases but one, they really weren't good candidates to begin with.
I know Sylvia Sessions-Lyons was probably the
that's
best
the only
candidate.
one. In every other case, the mother themselves, like, we don't have any indication that they ever claimed that was their child. We've kind of looked at circumstantial evidence. We've looked at later things. One of them is Zebulon Huntington, or Zebulon Jacobs. Yeah, who's Zena Huntington's son. I mean, his birth date and the date he would have been conceived just doesn't fit with the timetable. But maybe. Those are those things you never know for sure, so you might as well, especially if it's just Y chromosomal testing. It's easy enough to do if you have the people. But yeah, Sylvia Lyons Sessions is the only one, and even that there's some ambiguity as to whether or not she was claiming that that Josephine was the biological child of Joseph Smith, or she was, because she says that Joseph. And unfortunately, all we have is a very late secondhand account for it too. We have something that Josephine gave in the 19-teens about something her mother said 30 years ago. And she says, and then she quotes some others saying, she wanted to let me know that she didn't want to cause a spectacle, but she said that I'm actually Joseph Smith's daughter, my father being out of fellowship with the church at the time. So, I mean, does that mean that like Joseph's her legal father or spiritual father, in the sense because her father was out of fellowship at the church at the time she was born? But at the same time, why would she really want to keep that a secret? Why would she think that would cause a spectacle? I don't know. But in any case, and so the common interpretation of that is that Sylvia had reason to believe that Joseph was the father, but wasn't. So the common interpretation of that is that she was sexually active with her legal husband, Windsor Lyon, and Joseph at the same time. And she just assumed that Sylvia was Joseph's daughter incorrectly. So, I mean, that's that. So, but I mean, the question too is, like, why isn't there any DNA evidence? Why aren't there any children? And that argument is it's what you would call in logical terms a denying the antecedent argument, or a using the absence of evidence as evidence of absence. And so the argument goes, if Joseph Smith was sexually active with his wives, there would be a verifiable child. There is no verifiable child, therefore Joseph Smith was not sexually active with any other women besides Emma. And so in order for that argument to really hold up, one, you have to show that there were no children, and we really don't have any way to say that there weren't any. We don't. I mean, we know that there's not any that we know about. But if you're arguing exclusion, if you're arguing that premise, then you have to show that there wasn't. And there could be all kinds of reasons. Maybe there are, and we don't know who they were. Maybe the infant mortality plays a big role in that. I mean, Joseph and Emma were married 5 years before they had any child that lived and that we can verify by anything aside from documents, especially like aside from later documentation. Some of it after Joseph died. And so, I mean, and that's because they had children. They're just not children that lived much past childbirth, if even that far. And 5 years is longer than Joseph was ever involved in polygamy. And his first poor wife in Nauvoo, Louisa Beeman, I mean, she had 5 children with Brigham Young after she married him, before she died, and all of them died not either at childbirth or not long after.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, infant mortality is a big thing. So, and a lot of times with infant mortality, there's not records left of those children. They're not included. It just was a thing that happened there. There's a lot of Joseph's children who died at childbirth that we only know about because Lucy Mack Smith wrote that book, that autobiography in the 1850s. And so, I mean, that infant mortalities, and again, so that's one way. Another way is the way you kind of alluded to is maybe it was sexual activity that they were able to avoid conception with.
Yeah. Monica Lewinsky didn't get pregnant from Bill Clinton either.
But yeah, well, I mean, birth control is a bit more common in the 1990s than it was in the 1840s. But I mean, birth control is a possibility. But again, that's something I don't have any evidence that says that there's birth control. So I'm not that I would really expect there to be, because people don't really talk about that. But
I mean, that does bring up the idea. I know Dr. Larry Foster brought up the Oneida community, who were kind of a free love movement, and he said they had the most unusual form of birth control, which was basically don't get the man too excited. And in 20 years, there were less than
of unplanned pregnancies,
right. And so he said it was amazingly effective. So, I mean, clearly the people in the 1840s knew what caused birth and could do everything except for, intercourse, I guess.
It's possible. I mean, these were you could say these they were 1840s people, but I mean, these are people that are doing plural marriage. I mean, they're people that
and they had a reason to keep from getting pregnant too.
Yeah, that's the thing too. Is people say, well, one of the purposes, if not the purpose, for polygamy is to raise up righteous seed, and that might be true. But I think especially in Nauvoo, Joseph was laying the foundation for that. I mean, Joseph could be a pragmatist when he needed to be,
mm-hmm.
and so knowing having plural wives, especially when his legal wife doesn't know about, in a lot of cases, doesn't approve in any case, really. Yeah, I mean, he wasn't an idiot.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe he took some risks, but that wasn't an idiot. I mean, so I don't think. I mean, one case is one thing we know is when William Clayton, when his poor wife, conceives and becomes pregnant, and he approaches Joseph. The way William talks to Joseph about it, and the way Joseph responds, is they think it's a mistake. They don't think it's like a transgression, like he did something wrong by it, like in a moral sense, but something that is maybe not the smartest thing to do. And that's something that they need to figure out what they're going to do now. And so I think that kind of gives you some insight into their.
So when did this happen?
This is 1843. I'm not sure when.
And so we have a reference to a polygamous pregnancy prior to Joseph's death.
That's correct. We do. So we do. The other one is Joseph Bates Noble and his pro-wife Sarah. I mean, they have a pregnancy before that, and then the reference there is because I mean that's one of the things that polygamy skeptics bring up is like not only do we not have any pregnancies from Joseph Smith, but we don't have any from anybody that was involved. And Laurel Ulrich addresses that in A House Full of Females, which I highly recommend. It's she's one of the best, I think, the best prose writer who's ever written on novel polygamy. Reading the book it reads really well. She addresses that, and she cites a letter by the late Kimball to her husband Heber C. Kimball about Joseph Bates Noble and Sarah, and she says, "Oh, you were right. They are, and she alludes to they are expecting a child, and then she says, I don't think we don't have the faith for that yet." And so we're not quite ready for that yet. I think that's part of it. Is these people, they didn't go from having very Victorian, very traditional Christian mores about marriage and sex, becoming full-blown polygamous overnight. Not most of them. And so a lot of them, they had to get used to the idea. And then once more people did it, once their friends started doing it, then it becomes more normal to them. So I think that's a big part of it too. So there's a few other things. The other one is, and Laura Ulrich makes this point I should bring up too, is that it's often cited that Heber's Kimball and his wife Sarah Peaks, who's his first full wife, that they had a child together earlier. But there's conflicting evidence about whether or not her husband had come from England with her. And Laura Ulrich makes the point, and I agree with her, that letter, kind of implies that child was not Heber's.
And
that's
interesting.
Yeah, so I'm inclined to agree with that. So, yeah. So,
all right.
I think that is. So the other one is just the other possibility is just the low frequency of sexual relations. I mean, we don't really know for a lot of these. We know that there was a ceremony, that there were sexual relations might be implied. We have positive evidence of that in a few cases at least, but we don't really know very much about the frequency or really the extent. And so, I mean,
more than likely the frequency was not very often.
Yeah, not very often, and it could be that for some of them, Joseph may have had one or two encounters with those women, if at all, and then not again. And so, I mean, in a situation like that, I mean, women are usually fertile 1 or 2 days out of the month, and even then, there's maybe a 0.25% or a 25% chance that a conception is going to happen.
Right.
And so, in a situation like that, so in a monogamous situation where you have a married couple that's having relations regularly throughout the month, and within 3 or 4 months, they'd say then it's likely. But in a situation where maybe where it's sporadic, happens once or twice, and that's it. In a situation where they don't happen that often and it's not very extensive, then it's plausible. It's not so likely that a child would be conceived that we can say that since the child wasn't verified that we can say no, it didn't happen. So if you really combine all those things together, infant mortality, we don't really know about the frequency. I wouldn't say that the lack of children is a good reason to exclude the possibility that Joseph was sexually active with women other than Emma.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with attorney Mark Tensmeyer. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about the claim that D&C 132 was a forged revelation by Joseph Kingsbury. Is there other evidence to corroborate that the Kingsbury copy of D&C 132 is not a forgery?
Makes 2 copies of it, which the family keeps. And those copies are now in the church history library. And you can review them, and they are word for word the same as the Kingsbury manuscript. And so I really don't see any evidence that the Kingsbury manuscript is a later fabrication. Joseph Kingsbury testified to all of this, and both in a affidavit and then also in the temple lot.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe to patreon.com/gospeltangents for just $5 a month. Patreon is spelled patreon.com/gospeltangents. If you'd like to watch the entire video, you can subscribe at YouTube, Patreon, or on my website at gospeltangents.com and click the yellow subscribe button for just $8 a month. PDF transcripts are just $10 a month, and you can get those on patreon.com/gospeltangents or on my website. I'll send those to you as soon as I've finished completing it. If you'd like to get a paperback and PDF, just subscribe for $20 a month at either Patreon or on my website. Individual paperbacks are available at Amazon.com. Just do a search for Gospel Tangents Interview, and you can find all of our past interviews there. Show your Gospel Tangents pride by purchasing a t-shirt on our website at gospeltangents.com/shop. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. You can get our latest updates by friending me at Facebook, or you can also follow our page at facebook.com/gospeltangents. Become an insider and you can see the newest videos. Follow us on Twitter at Gospel Tangents. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some of our great videos. Thanks again.